Hi, I'm Jack Whitehead, and this afternoon, it's the 6th of April 2014, I shall be presenting a paper at the American Educational Research Association in Philadelphia in a session entitled Educational Responses to Epistemological Issues. And my paper is titled, How Does the Constraining Power of Education Researchers Influence the Emergence of Educational Knowledge and Theory? And what I wanted to do just for a few minutes before I present is to give you some indication of my intentions in relation to this paper. And then what I want to do is to actually see whether or not I managed to live these intentions in the practice of the symposium, and hopefully then gain some responses from the ideas, not necessarily in the session itself, but later, because I'll show the participants in the session where they can access the paper on the internet at my homepage, which is called actionresearch.net. Now, what I do in this paper is, first of all, to make a stipulative definition. It's an expression of meaning between educational researchers and education researchers, and educational theory and education theory. Now, the significance of this distinction goes back to my early understanding of educational theory when I studied the philosophy of education between 1968 and 70 at the Institute of Education of London University. And the professors who were very influential in developing what was called the disciplines approach to educational theory held that educational theory was constituted by the philosophy, psychology, sociology, and history of education. Now, in 1971-72, I rejected this approach because I could not explain my educational influences, either in my own learning or in the learning of my students, using the disciplines approach to educational theory. And I believe that any valid educational theory should be able to produce a valid explanation of an individual's educational influence in learning. It was only in 1983 that Paul Hurst acknowledged the mistake, a fundamental mistake in the disciplines approach, when he said that the practical principles of teachers like myself were viewed in the disciplines approach as at best a first crude and superficial set of principles that had their justification in practice, and that in any rationally developed theory would be replaced by the principles from the disciplines. Now, it was that idea that my practical principles as a practicing educator would be replaced in the disciplines approach that made me very clear about why I rejected the approach, because I wanted a form of educational theory within which my practical principles, and by that I was meaning certain fundamental ontological values that I use and that were embodied in my practice and that I could use to explain my educational influence. So I want to make this distinction between educational theory, which is actually being constituted by practitioners as they explain their own educational influences in learning, and the education theory, which is constituted by contributions from the disciplines, like the philosophy of education, the sociology of education. Now, I hope that distinction is clear, because it has implications for what counts as an education researcher or an educational researcher. And this distinction that I want to make is to establish that an educational researcher can explain the educational influences not only in learning, but the learning has got to be related to the values that actually constitute the flourishing of humanity. So I want that distinction to be really very clear, because an education researcher can actually generate explanations from within the disciplines of education, like the psychology or the philosophy or the sociology, history. And I would then go on to talk about the administration or the management, the theology, the economics of education. But those kinds of explanations are distinguishable from the explanations being produced by educational researchers who are explaining educational influences in learning with the values that count towards the flourishing of humanity. So I make that first stipulative expression of this meaning in my paper. Now I then go on to talk about the dominance of the language of education researchers in the calls for papers for the American Education Research Association, because part of my paper is trying to show that the dominance of education researchers is actually getting in the way of the emergence of valid forms of educational theory. These explanations of educational influence in learning that, if you like, the education researchers, because of the dominance of the language of educational research, is actually masking the emergence of these other forms of explanation from educational researchers. And you can see this very clear dominance of the language of education researchers in the calls for papers for AERA and the statements on the themes from the presidents and the programme chairs of AERA from 2012, 13 and 14. Now, what I've done in the paper is to actually pick out from the themes the language that is all focused on the language of education researchers. For example, from 2012, the theme on to know is not enough, there is the statement, while we as education researchers wholeheartedly agree that to know is critically important, we must also recognise that the scholars who penned our organisation's mission statement were indeed visionaries. So it's the language of the education researcher, again, is within the statements to publish only the best education research. And again, that statement, while we as education researchers. In 2013, we had William Turney and Wren's theme, with the language of the education researchers. And I put up a response on YouTube where I actually point to this dominance of the language of the education researchers, which I claim is masking the language and the logic of educational researchers. And again, the dominance of the education researcher, the language, is most clear in the theme for 2014 at this AERA, which is on the theme of the power of education research for innovation in practice and policy. And the whole language is about education research, and you'll see in the theme that there is no mention whatsoever of educational research. So I want to again emphasize the domination of the language of the education researcher, and follow up this by claiming that this is actually constraining the emergence or the focus on the language and logic of the educational researcher. Now, in contrast to this dominance of the education researcher, in this paper I try to show what can emerge from a very different perspective of the educational researcher who is generating valid explanations of educational influences in learning, in one's own learning and the learning of others, and also the learning of the social formations in which the research is located. And I go back to 1993's presidential address by Elliot Eisner, who was advocating the use of very different forms of representation for communicating our understandings of educational research. And I also draw attention to the importance of the idea of influence, because I want to claim that educational researchers will be able to explain the educational influences in learning of teachers with their students, and not just within the educational context of schools, but also in other workplaces. Now, this perspective, which is a very different perspective to the one generated by the education researchers, is actually followed by an understanding of a notion of a living logic. And I want to be, again, very clear about this, because in the session that I'm contributing to about educational responses to epistemological issues, the issue of logic is very significant, because, if you like, the logic really helps to define the nature of the rationality of the explanations we're offering. And I often go back to Marcuse's notion as logic, as a mode of thought, which is appropriate for comprehending the real as rational. And in my own history, I've actually shown that I can use the propositional logic that goes back to Aristotle with his 3 laws of logic. I've demonstrated that I can also use a dialectical logic, which actually contains contradictions as its nucleus. And there is that 2,500 year history of the struggles between dialectical and propositional logicians, where you can have dialectical logicians or the propositional logicians claiming that the other side lacks rationality. And it's best illustrated in Karl Popper's work, where in the middle of the last century he just claimed that dialecticians and the dialectical theories are based on nothing better than a loose and woolly way of speaking, and because they contain contradictions are entirely useless as theories. And on the other hand, about 1964, you have Marcuse claiming that the people like Popper who use the propositional logic are masking the dialectical or contradictory nature of reality. So the idea that there is a living logic, which is dynamic and inclusional, and relational, which can actually integrate insights from propositional theories and also dialectical theories, is what I'm hoping to draw to the attention of the participants this afternoon, because we're considering educational responses to epistemological issues. And I think that the notion of the logic of the explanations we offer is actually right at the heart of these epistemological issues, and an educational response will be to try to show how valid explanations can be generated by practitioners, which can actually offer valid explanations of educational influences in learning, can draw insights from dialectical and propositional theories, whilst at the same time using a living logic for the nature of the explanations themselves. And I think this is one of the most, if you like, important contributions that the paper makes to these educational responses to epistemological issues, because I'm claiming that we need to focus on the nature of the educational theories that individuals or researchers can generate to produce valid explanations of educational influences in learning. And I'm claiming that the education researchers and their education theories, whilst they can have value in creating one's own what I call living theory, can actually serve to mask the living logics which help to constitute the rationality of these valid forms of explanations of educational influence. So on the one hand, the theories can actually have helpful insights, but once they're only used, once the logic and language of education researchers is the sole logic and language, as it is and has been within the themes for the last 3 years of AERA, I'm claiming that these are actually masking what is involved in generating valid forms of educational theory. And I offer within the paper the locations on the web where you can contrast the multimedia narratives, which include visual data, to try to show over time how valid forms of educational explanations can be offered, how valid forms of living theory can be generated in relation to pointing to the visual data using a process that we call empathetic resonance, where you look for the feelings of what it is that you're seeing as it's resonating with the values that you hold, which you actually associate with the flourishing of humanity. And this is a very different process to my first introduction to linguistic and British analytic philosophy, where we would actually sit down to clarify the meanings of the words we used in terms of other words. So we would come to a concept of punishment, for example, as involving the intentional infliction of pain by somebody in authority on somebody who'd broken a rule. Now, that is where these lexical definitions, where words are described and defined in terms of other words, have their value. But I'm claiming that unless we move towards more ostensive expressions of meaning from what it is we're doing in our educational practice, we will not be able to clarify the meanings of these energy-flowing values that we use to give meaning and purpose to our lives and which form explanatory principles in the creation of our educational theories. Now, I'm just hoping that that is what I can actually communicate in the session this afternoon. And I'm hoping that it will actually evoke some responses, not just in the session itself, but that it will encourage people to go to both my own website, actionresearch.net, but perhaps more importantly, the website of what of the journal called the Educational Journal of Living Theories, which I'll be showing hopefully this afternoon, where you can engage in responses to some of these multimedia narratives, where, as the title of the journal implies, individuals are generating and making public their own living educational theories. So that is what I hope to accomplish this afternoon. Again, thank you for listening.